Hey there, it's Olivia Savannah here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you a recent reads wrap up where I wrap up 10 of the books that I've recently read for you. I'll also have content warnings in the description box down below if that's something you might need, but without further ado, we've got plenty of books here to talk about, so let's get right down to the books. One of the books I've recently read is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson, which is one of the most hyped YA murder mysteries out there, and I do love the YA murder mystery genre. I'm a big fan of Karen M. McManus, so I thought I would try this one. And in this one we're following a young girl who is going to dig up a cold case that's happened where there has been someone who is murdered in her town, and they've decided who it is who murdered that person, but she thinks that is not the case. She thinks it's not the truth, so she is going to figure out who actually did it. And it was fine. I didn't love this one as much as everybody else seems to. I just could not connect with our main character. She is off solving this cold case, and that's the entirety of her personality. She's obsessed with the case. She wants to organize everything. She wants to track everything. She is just all about this case, so much so that I feel like we did not get a sense of her personality beyond she wants to solve this case, and that is her motivation for doing so. But saying that, I did appreciate how she went about solving the case. It felt really realistic for someone who's a teenager who's solving a case. Like the way that she approached it, the way that she talked to people, like everything that she did felt very authentic and very true to what it might be like for a teenager who's digging through the past that's already dead and buried and trying to find out what really happened. So I can appreciate that at its core, this is actually a very good murder mystery, and it's realistic to the age, audience and genre that it's in. But at the same time, I am a character-driven reader. I do need to connect to characters, and I even tried to connect to the characters around her, but there honestly weren't that many. It was her, it was the brother of the person who was accused for being the murderer, and that was it. Those two were the two main characters, and everybody else was a secondary or side character or a suspect, and so you never really got close to them, you never really got to know them properly, and so it felt very narrow in its scope in terms of characters, but very wide in its scope in terms of plot. So if you are a plot-driven reader, you are probably going to enjoy this book a whole lot more. I can't really fault this book for anything more than that. I didn't predict entirely who did it, although I had very strong suspicions that were correct. And it was a good journey to be on. I finished it, I read it fairly quickly, it was nice. I'm just never going to really remember this book, and I do just think Karen M. McManus is the queen of this genre and does it a bit better. And I know it's unfair to compare, but those two are the most popular at the moment, so I can't help comparing them a little bit. I won't, unfortunately, be continuing on with the series. People do say it gets better with each and every book, but what I saw in this one just did not impress me enough for me to continue. I will let this lie. It was a decent time, not a long time. Then I finally got around to finishing and reading Raybearer by Ifueko. This is a young adult fantasy book, and let me tell you, this is absolutely a fantastic read. When I read young adult fantasy, this is the kind of book I want to be reading. So how do I explain this? You're following a character called Tarasai, and Tarasai has grown up in this very sheltered, very isolated land where she is looked after by her mother, who she calls the lady, and one day she gets cursed to murder this prince. However, when she meets the prince, she starts to really like the prince, and so she does not want to murder him, she does not want to fulfill this curse, and she does everything within her power to fight against that. There's also a lot of other magical elements at play, because the prince is part of this fantasy kingdom where powers are at bay, and he has to make a court, and the people within his court are the only people who have the ability to kill him. So there's a whole load of like layers to this story, and I don't want to give anything away because it's so much fun to pick them apart and unpeel them and discover them as you read. But this book has fantastic black representation in the way that our main character is black, and there are other black mythology elements woven into this, but at the same time it's a very unique fantasy world. It's a very unique fantasy setting that has been carefully layered and built as you read this singular book. I was impressed by the depth of world building. I was impressed by the royal system and the magic building, and how it has time for that in a book that is so very full of other plot elements and character developments as well. I love the characters in this. They are all very, very unique from each other, and I liked seeing their personalities develop. It's got some found family feels in the ways in which this court of royals have to come together, but also it's got such cool magical powers. I feel like sometimes you see the same magical powers or superpowers manifesting over and over again in different books and in different media, but in this one there were some powers that I just hadn't thought of before or hadn't seen written about before, so I felt like it was very unique in that sense. And I really like the way that each character's magical powers or like magical skill sets contributed to who they were as a person and how they fit into this found family-esque group. I'm just so impressed by how many plot threads there are, because there's the main plot that I just told you, but there are quite a few side stories that are definitely going to be picked up in the second book, which is the finale of this series, and I was just impressed with how the authors managed to write them all in a way where none of the plot threads felt lesser than the other. They were all given the right amount of time, they were all given the right amount of development and effort, and yet they didn't stray from the main plot that you are focused on and discovering in this particular book. I wouldn't even say that Tarasai is my favourite character, even though she's the main character. I do think one of the side characters are my favourites. I liked how messy the romance was. There's a bit of will they won't they in this, in terms of there's not just one love interest that she can go for, but at the same time there's none of that love triangle drama. It's really just a matter of this is the political system and this is how the romance fits within this. There's also ace rep in this as well. It's so well done. There's so much in it, and I'm so glad that I finally read it when I was in the perfect mood and waited to read it for when I was in the mood for YA fantasy, because this was divine and I cannot wait to pick up the sequel. I was having a great time with fantasy reads. I read The River of Silver by S.A. Chakraborty, and I gave this book 5 stars and it became a new favourite. This is the 4th book, kind of, in the Daevabad trilogy by Shannon Chakraborty that I've talked about previously on my channel. I love it. It's one of my favourite fantasy trilogies. I just think it's so very good, and this is a short story collection that you can read after the trilogy. Please read the whole trilogy before reading this, and it's short stories from different characters' perspectives in this world. Some of them are set before the series begins, some are set during, and some are set afterwards. And even though this is a short story collection, I will also say that sometimes it feels a bit like reading deleted scenes. Deleted scenes as well as extra short stories. I loved them. I loved each and every single one. I am amazed by this series because the world building is just so extensive and so brilliantly done, and so it just feels like a whole other world in terms of the languages that you're going on, the political cultures and clashes, the ways that you go from different areas of this world. Like the characters truly travel across the world in this, and the history, it's so rich in history, and you really see how the history in this world impacts what's happening in the present day as you're reading. All of it is flawlessly done, and you can discover that in the trilogy. And it's been a couple of years since I read the trilogy, but when I started to read this, I felt like I was just sinking straight back into the world and its richness, and it was just like coming home. I was so happy to be there. But even more than that, I was so happy to hear more about the characters. By the time you get to the main trilogy, some of the characters have already established relationships, some of them are just forming relationships, and some relationships don't even have an outcome by the end of the series. So you get to kind of see a bit more about those and about some behind the scenes stuff that impacts people's choices in the main trilogy. Because if you read the main trilogy, you'll know that at some points you do get a time jump, and this fills in some of the gaps as well. I loved it. Prince Ali is I love Prince Ali. I love him with my whole heart. He is fantastic. He is just, I don't even want to describe him because I don't want to give anything away, but I love Prince Ali with my whole heart, and he has 3 short stories in this, and every single one of his short stories was absolutely superb. But also I loved hearing more from Jamshid, who you don't get a point of view from in the main trilogy. It was nice to kind of get into Mundatir's head a bit more. I'm probably butchering that name, I'm afraid, even after all of these books of this series that I've read. But yes, coming back to Nari, who is one of the best female protagonists that I've ever read in a book. I stand by that. It's just like everything I want from these characters was given to me in this short story collection. So if you're a big fan of the series, this is a shoo-in. You should definitely read it. You'll definitely love it, and it just made my heart so happy. Now I'm going to tell you about a short story. So I'm holding up a copy of For Real by Alexis Hall, and that's because in the back of For Real, in the new editions, because they're being traditionally published with new covers, you'll get the bonus short story which is called In Vino, and that is the one that I'm talking about and reviewing here. So I'll just leave a cover here of what In Vino looks like. But For Real is my favourite Alexis Hall book ever. It's his BDSM, very steamy one, so it makes sense why it's my favourite. It was also the first Alexis Hall book I've ever read, and if you have not read For Real, please get yourself a copy of this and read it instantly, because it is, in my head, the best age gap BDSM romance that's queer. Like, it's fantastic. And then In Vino is a short story that's about one of the characters in For Real, who you meet in passing when there's a certain trip in Oxford. And I was curious to see what this character was going to bring, because his love story is a little bit tragic. It's a bit sidelined in the main book and you see it in the background, but you can't really dig that much into it. I thought In Vino might dig a bit more into it, but unfortunately the short story doesn't really do that. The short story is basically a sex scene, that's what it is, and it rubbed me up the wrong way for a couple of reasons. Mainly because it's a teacher-student dynamic, which I'm not a big fan of. It's also an age gap within the teacher-student dynamic, which I'm extra not a big fan of, and I just wanted more. Like, this character has such a tragic romantic storyline happening, but it's not even between him and the person he has that tragic romantic storyline with. It's between him and a hookup, like a one-night stand. So it doesn't have that much substance to it. It's just basically reading sex without any connection to the characters, and that's not really what I'm here for when I'm reading my romance books. That said, I will say Alexis Hall's characterization in the book, in Vino, is really good. Like, you immediately get a sense of these two very distinctive different characters, their personalities and how they fit together while they are having sex. But also the sex itself is really steamy and it's really hot and it's really well described, because Alexis Hall is one of the best steamy scene writers out there, honestly, in my opinion. So it's like, I didn't like it for multiple reasons, but in some ways I just did, because his writing is that good. So yes, make of that what you will. I read a middle grade. I feel like it's been a little while since I did, and I read Me, My Dad and the End of the Rainbow by Benjamin Dean. I gave this book 5 stars and it became a new favourite. I read this and I just wanted to like sob internally, because I'm not a crier, but sob in happy tears. So in this book you're following this young little boy, I believe he's around 11 or 12, that kind of age, or even 10 maybe, and his dad has recently come out as gay, or his dad is in the process of coming out as gay. He's quite confused. First of all, his parents split, his dad moves out, he doesn't understand why they can't get along, and he's feeling quite embarrassed because they seem to be arguing all over the place. Well, at the same time, you can clearly see that the parents still care for each other. Something has shifted in their dynamic and he doesn't understand. And then his dad mentions the fact that he is gay. And from this secondary kind of view of this child, you get to see the dad kind of struggling as he is trying to come out to different people, as his friends, as his ex-wife or ex-wife to be, and as his child kind of need to understand him, or try to understand, because so much change is happening, and this poor little boy is just worried that his relationship with his dad is changing beyond comprehension. When he discovers a flyer at the bottom of the mess in his dad's car, and his flyer is talking about something called pride, and he wonders if pride could have the answers for smoothing out the changing relationship between him and his dad. And it was just absolutely lovely. I think this is one of these books where it's just so filled with love that you can't help but feel that emotion while you're reading it. He clearly loves his dad, he clearly wants his dad to be okay, and he really just wants to do what he can to show that love, to establish that love, even though everything seems like it's changing. And the mum loves him and his friends love him, and he's he's trying to talk to his friends about this situation. It's really hard for him to articulate because he doesn't have all the language and terminology and words, but his friends so clearly love him and want to be there for him. They're ready to help him on his adventures and his quest to understand his dad better. And yeah, I think what really struck me about this book was the ringing endorsement of love that flows all the way through it from beginning to the end. And it's one of those books that is just pure queer joy. You can see how the coming out process can be difficult as an adult, can be hard to do at a later point in your life, but there is so much queer joy woven into this, in the characters that you meet along the way, in the outcome, and therefore it just feels again like a celebration of love and a really warm hug. I highly recommend parents, teachers, guardians, and also adults if you read middle grade, to just read this one, to read it with your kids, to talk to them about what it means to be queer, to talk to them about what like pride means and why people celebrate it. This is a really good introductory book for people and to spawn and start those conversations, while also feeling like an actual story with characters and a plot and a journey for them to follow, so it's not just information. I really think this is going to become one of my favourite queer middle grade books, and such a joy. I can't wait to recommend it all over the place. We are now halfway through the books, so this is a very good time for me to tell you that I have a couple of books which are Patreon exclusive wrap-ups. If you join any tier of my Patreon, you can access these wrap-ups that are exclusive to Patreons, and also each of my Patreon exclusives are available to purchase. Rather than subscribing, you can access that particular exclusive wrap-up if you just want to hear my thoughts on these books alone without subscribing. But those books are Heart Song by TJ Klune, the third book in the Wolf Song series, which I've been obsessed with this year, and if you want my thoughts on that, head over there. And also for Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, which is a gothic feeling haunted sentient house story. So if you want my thoughts on either of those, please head over to my Patreon, and thank you to all of my patrons who are currently subscribed. I truly appreciate you more than words can express. But moving on with the books, we're going to talk about young adult contemporary for a little bit. So I read Ophelia After All by Racquel Marie, and this one is a young adult coming of age story, and I will say it is not a romance book, even though there's a lot of romance feelings in this. It's another queer joy book. So I started reading this one and I read the first half, and it's very focused on this lovely woman here who is in her final year of school. She's someone who has crushes on all of the guys all of the time. She just goes through crushes. She loves to be feeling like she's in love, even though she doesn't often act on her crushes. But prom is coming up and she wants to have this sweeping prom experience. She's worried about university and what she wants to do in the future, when she starts to have feelings for a girl in her class, and she's not sure if her parents, if her friends are ready to see her as someone who is beyond boy crazy Ophelia, but somebody else. Now, I read the first half of this book and it felt very, this is where the book is going. You know what's going to happen, you understand these characters, you know what they're doing. It's very focused on the American school system and prom, and I'm a UK person, so I wasn't really relating to that storyline that much. So I was just reading it and I was thinking, this is predictable, it's going to be a middle of the road read, I know where everything is going. And then I hit the halfway mark and oh my goodness me, I did not expect this story to explode into what it exploded into. I think it's really fascinating when you get character-driven stories that manage to surprise you. And this character-driven story really fooled me into thinking I knew where we were going. And I'm not going to say like it was a massive plot twist or anything, but it just was me assuming I knew what this story was going to do, and then it very much did something different, and that was refreshing, and I appreciated this. I really liked the complexity of this narrative. There's a lot of teenagers fancying different people as teenagers do, and messy teenage emotions, bit of a love triangle here and there, not for the main character but for side characters. So if love triangles put you off, don't let that put you off, it's not the main perspective. But there's a lot of different people falling for different people. There's a lot of queer emotions in this, like so much queer representation as they're discovering who they are, who their identity is, what these feelings mean, what the terms for these feelings are beyond the three that most people seem to know, which is gay, lesbian and bi. And I really liked seeing how hard it was for them to unpick those emotions and how hard it was to talk about being someone who's changing. I think we take for granted sometimes that when you meet loads of different people, you can change who you are, and that's fine. But if you are going to be staying in the same town as you've lived in all your life, people make assumptions about you, or people assume they know you, and maybe they do. But what happens when you change? How can you start those conversations with those around you? And ultimately, even though this one does talk about queerness a lot and does talk about messy love a lot, the main focus in this is friendship. That's like a really strong thread throughout this book, and I always appreciate books that push friendship as one of the main themes above all else, because I think even more so than romantic relationships, when you need someone, you will fall back on your friends, and there's a lot of conflict between the friendships here and the families here, and I appreciated how all of them were resolved and how all of them were reached that resolution. I think the steps that they took to reach that resolution were very, very healthy. And so at the end of this book, I was actually absolutely blown away in terms of how much I enjoy young adult contemporary, and I just wish that the first half of this book had been as strong as the rest of it was, because it's one of those ones that actually deserves the hype that it got, and meant a lot to me, like really meant a lot to me. I was giggling, smiling, laughing when I finished this book. Because I was clearly in the mood to read queer young adult contemporary, I decided to continue doing that, and I read Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera. Now this one I have a bit more complicated thoughts on, but it's about this Latin teenager from the Bronx who reads this book about the power of your vagina, essentially, and she is blown away, she's gobsmacked, and it puts her in a different mindset, and it empowers her to come out to her family as a lesbian. And within her culture, that's really like not seen as okay, so she's really struggling with the fact that she's come out, and then she goes on an internship to work with the author who wrote this book. But maybe not everything that she thought about this author is as sunshine, roses and daisies as she assumed it might be for someone who wrote such an open-minded book. That's where we are with this one. And actually there's a Goodreads review by one of my Goodreads friends called Corey, who just really says everything that I want to say about this book so well, so I'm actually going to leave that Goodreads link down below if you want to read some more concise thoughts on this book. But I really liked it, but I struggled with it, and the reason why I struggled with it is because there's a lot of a certain type of mindset that is so far from my reality. A lot of the manifestation, a lot of the drinking these herbal teas and these scents will help you, all of that kind of spirituality practice is not me. It's just not who I am. And we've got a main character who believes in all of that and does all of that, which I'm happy to read about, but at the same time is quite problematic. And it's about Juliet kind of learning who is problematic and what it means when someone can both be problematic and really inspiring and have good things and valid things to say. And I think we don't unpick the difficulties of that person's really toxic, but they still have a point. And how do you connect those people? How do they fit into the life that you are building and the mentality and practices that you're building when there are people around you who are good for you and bad for you at the same time? And so I appreciate that this young adult book is tackling such a complicated subject and doing it quite well. It just means that you are going to have to read through a lot of racism, a lot of sexism, a lot of transphobia to be able to get the outcome, and that can be quite an arduous process if you are not strapped in for the ride ahead of time. So do be strapped in for the ride. I liked seeing some of the self-actualization, I liked seeing some of the self-realization and epiphanies and conclusions that Juliet came to, and how she was really learning and unlearning and learning and unlearning throughout this book, and tackling those hard conversations that you have to have with the people in your life, i.e. her family, as she has recently come out to them, but also the new friends and circles that she is swimming in. It's not a romance again. I would also say it's not a romance, even though there is quite a bit on love and feelings here. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Juliet is also unpicking her queerness and her romantic feelings and learning about polyamory and such as she is coming of age in this book. I will also say that this book is not without flaws. There are a couple of statements here that are said that are kind of thrown away statements, like throwaway statements, but are actually not okay and weren't addressed and needed to be unpicked. I think at one point Juliet comes out and the girl that she's with at the time doesn't come out with her, and she says like, oh, my girlfriend should come out as well because I just came out, and like that's not true. People come out at their own stages and at their own time. There are a couple of other statements that I can't remember off my head where I was just like, actually, that's a bit of a trouble and it's not readdressed. So again, if you want to look at those a bit more, Corey's review does mention all of them. That stood out to me. So I do think this is not perfect, but it's just really good that it's out there. So it's one of those ones that I still am really happy that teenagers have out there to read and to learn from and to unpick and to see themselves in, but at the same time, it's not perfect. We've actually got quite a few 5 stars in this wrap up, which is absolutely delightful. I read Girls That Never Die by Safia Elhillo. This is a collection of poetry, and I'll leave the finished cover here, which is much more gorgeous. I gave this 5 stars. It became a new favourite poetry collection. It is absolutely masterful. So this is by a Black Sudanese poet, and if you know about Sudan's political situation at the moment, you'll know that there's a lot of emotions that can be imbued into this poetry, and a lot of it is tackling those tough subjects. It's tackling what home means, what displacement means. A lot of it has to do with FGM. If you don't know what FGM is, I'll leave it in the description box down below, but that is kind of at the forefront of quite a few of these poems, which is a really challenging subject to tackle, but oh my gosh, did this poetry collection tackle it very well. It talks about sexism, it talks about motherhood and womanhood and the expectation that little girls grow up way too soon. There's so much femininity here, so much female rage, but also so much female healing and so much female hurt. These poems just were doing so much work. I had to literally, I had to read them one by one, bit by bit, and every single one I had to sit down and think on my feelings and process it because it was carrying so much emotion, but it is so worth reading for that reason. And it is one of those poetry collections that deploy all of the literary elements, the way that the words are formed on the page. They mean a lot. It has one of my favorite forms of poetry where you've got 2 columns in a poem and you can read it going this way. You can read one column as a poem and you can read another column as a poem, and so there's like 3 ways to read the same poem but get different things out of reading them in each method. I liked those poems. I think there's 1 or 2 of them in here. They're incredibly hard to do, so very masterful, and kudos to Safia Elhillo for pulling it off. But there's also poems where the form is played around with on the page. The enjambment is so precise, like where the lines cut and finish and continue. That's all really purposefully chosen. The descriptions and the imagery, it's grounded enough in actual situations in real life for you to understand and kind of feel the tangibility of the poems, while also enough metaphor is deployed and enough literary devices that you can feel the craftsmanship that has been put into every single one of these poems, and the way that it channels the emotion, like the weight of responsibility that women have to carry even though they don't want to, or that it's pushed upon them by uncles or men in the community. You feel that weight when you read these poems, and you feel that pain and hurt and that suffering that has been pushed down and forced down the throat of so many girls. Girls That Never Die is a very ample title, and it's just masterful. Please, if you read poetry, this is a very, very good collection to read. I wouldn't say it's beginner poetry level, but if you've read a bit of poetry, it's a good one. It's a really, really, really good one. I did say that I was in a young adult queer reading mood, and I've been also in my country music era. I've been loving Chris Stapleton, I've been loving Thomas Rhett. There's just all the cowboys. So I read a cowboy young adult queer contemporary book, and it's called A Little Bit Country by Brian D. Kennedy. I had so much fun with this. I had a blast. There's 2 boys. One of them is Luke. He lives in this town, he hates country music, it's forbidden in his household, and he ends up working at this restaurant which is within a music park that celebrates a country singer, and he wants to become the owner of a restaurant. That's his dreams and his aspiration, but his family are struggling financially. His mum is really, really ill, and he's just trying his best to make ends meet. He's also gay and closeted, and he doesn't know how to bring that up with his very religious mother. And then there is Emmett. Emmett swans in for his summer to work at this country theme park. He loves country music, he sings country music, and he wants to be the world's biggest country music gay superstar. However, he's really bad at writing songs, and that's one of the things that's really important in country music, in his opinion. So you're following these 2 boys who meet, and they have their love story, and it's lovely. Emmett is very out and proud, Luke is closeted and it's all secret on his end, and Emmett's quite well off, Luke is not, hates country music, loves country music. So you can see the opposites and the conflicts that are going to be discussed in this book. What I really liked about this was the boys, like the boys' characterization is so very good. Emmett is a ball of sunshine, Luke is more reserved and quiet and serious and hurting. You can see I really related to Luke. He's a very angsty boy. He's a private angsty boy. He channels that, and I really related to Luke for that reason. His mum is disabled and has a condition that seems to have its ups and downs, and that just makes it really difficult for the family as she can't work anymore, and we all know what the financial situation is in terms of healthcare in the US, so they're really struggling to make ends meet. And you can just see how he's really taken on the brunt of responsibility. His dad is working 2 jobs, night shift and day shift. He's there looking after his siblings, and he just wants to make his mother happy. He doesn't want to disappoint his mother, and that's why he doesn't really want to stir the pot in terms of coming out. But when he meets Emmett, he's like questioning, what does it mean to fancy someone this much? Can I pursue this relationship if I'm going to be closeted all the time? Is it right for me to come out just because I'm in a relationship right now? And their relationship is so lovely. These boys, they go on very cute dates, they fall for each other, they fit very well, and you can see how that attraction is catching, and it's just a really lovely love story. And the tension is not actually in their love story, and the tension itself is not in the fact that one of them is closeted and one of them isn't. Luke himself personally is having an emotional journey where he's realizing, maybe I can't live for my mother, maybe I need to live for myself in some ways, maybe it's okay to dream and have aspirations. But the conflict in their relationship is not the fact that he is not out. There is no conflict in their relationship is fine. The conflict is in external matters, in the fact that maybe Emmett has a chance at music, but they don't want him to sing gay songs. Maybe Luke is aspiring too high with his restaurant ambitions. And I really liked the fact that the queerness, like the core queerness at the root of this, is not actually where the conflict lies. But the book does not shy away from being a love song to country music as well. There's a lot of country culture in this, a lot of celebration. Even though they give a fictional name to the superstar in this, it's pretty much Dolly Parton. We all know it's Dolly Parton. And so it was like a really lovely celebration of country music, and as a fan of that, it really made me so happy. You don't have to enjoy country music to enjoy this book, but at the same time, it does discuss some of the downsides of country culture. It talks about how homophobic it is, it talks about how racist it is, and it takes the chance to address those situations while still feeling like a very good celebration of the culture too. This is one of the books that warmed my heart and brought me so much joy, but still manages to touch on some tough subjects, and I will appreciate that it's out there and recommend it beyond belief. And the last book I'm going to talk about in this wrap up here is also a poetry collection, and that is To Sweeten Bitter by Raymond Antrobus. This is Raymond Antrobus's very first poetry collection, and Raymond Antrobus is one of my favourite poets of all time. He is a mixed race, Jamaican, British, deaf poet, and a lot of that is woven into his poetry. Now, I've read his later collections, so going back to his first one was quite interesting, and I didn't love it as much. I think it was just okay. I think if I read this first, I would have appreciated it a whole lot more, because I've now read his later stuff and I can just see how he's grown as a poet. And it's interesting reading this because I can see the roots of who he becomes as a poet later on. Like, I've seen the development, I've seen the trajectory, and also I've actually read quite a few of these poems because I've been able to, very luckily, see Raymond Antrobus perform his poetry 3 times now. So I've actually seen him perform poetry 3 times, and he's performed quite a few of these ones, so I've actually already read in some form a lot of these poets already, and I actually think the ones of these that I've read before are actually better when they're performed rather than on the page, and I can see why he performs mostly from this poetry collection rather than some of his later ones. It was good, but it just wasn't the best, and I think his literary devices, deployment of work, his narrative in his poems, and also just the complexity of them has been developed throughout time. So I'm glad I read this, but it's not actually one that's going to linger in my mind quite a lot, and I'm looking forward to reading his latest poetry collection, which is recently published, called Science Music, next. there you have it. Those are 10 books that I've recently read. Please let me know in the comment section down below, have you read any of these books, or what was the last book you recently read and enjoyed? Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be updated every time I have a new video. And you know what they say, onwards and upwards. Excelsior!